On Monday morning, at 9:30 a.m. sharp, I walked into the main 32nd floor conference room of the Vance Sterling Group. The hum of the air conditioning was a frigid whisper. Beyond the massive plate glass window, the November sun glinted harshly off the glass canyons of Manhattan. But inside this room of chilled glass and dark walnut, everything felt cold to the point of indifference. I sat down in my usual seat to the left of the long conference table, placing a navy blue file folder in front of me, next to a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. The bitter aroma of the coffee mingled with the expensive colognes and perfumes of those seated around the table, creating an atmosphere that was both luxurious and suffocating. Everyone was staring at the large presentation screen at the front of the room, but I knew what they were truly waiting for wasn't in the fourth quarter business plan. I could feel their eyes flit towards me before quickly looking away. Some held pity, others were waiting for the drama to unfold. Some feigned interest in their documents, but their trembling hands gave them away. In the world of business, loyalty is often paper thin. People only stand with the winning side. And this morning, nearly everyone believed the winning side was not mine. Seated at the center of the table was Daniel Harris, the CEO of Vance Sterling, and my legal husband for the past 5 years. He wore a charcoal gray suit with a burgundy tie, his face as handsome, calm, and composed as it had been when he first made me believe I had chosen the right man. But only I could see the faint blue vein pulsing at his wrist as he held his pen, and the way his eyes avoided mine as if dodging a cut that was too deep. I understood that look. It wasn't remorse, it was the nervous anticipation of a man about to play his final card, still fearful that his opponent might have a hidden ace. Seated to his right was Chloe Reed, the vice president who had been appointed less than a week ago. She was young and beautiful, with porcelain skin, crimson lips, and hair styled in waves just loose enough to look effortless, yet meticulously cared for down to the last strand. Her wine-red sheath dress clung to her slender frame, and her stiletto heels clicked against the marble floor with a sharp, jarring sound. She was only 27, but she already knew how to enter a room full of powerful men with a look of innocence and a smile that held a spark of fire. Those were the same eyes that, 3 months ago, had looked at me with sweet reverence during her staff introduction. Back then, she had called me Miss Vance, with utmost respect. Today, I suspected she would call me something else entirely. The meeting began with a few growth figures projected onto the screen. The investment department reported, the operations department reported, the finance department reported. All of it was delivered flawlessly, but no one was truly listening. I heard the words without processing them, my hand slowly stirring the silver spoon in my coffee cup. The metal clinked against the porcelain with a small, steady, cold sound. It was the only sound in the room that wasn't a lie. Then, Chloe Reed stood up. She didn't ask for permission, nor did she wait for the HR segment as was customary. She stood at the head of the table, her long, slender fingers resting on a prepared stack of papers, the corner of her mouth lifting into a half smile, just enough to seem friendly to others, just enough for me to see the arrogance. Before we continue with the year-end plan, I would like to announce an important personnel decision. The entire room fell silent. For the first time that morning, I lifted my eyes to look at her. Chloe tilted her head slightly, her voice as sweet as honey. Based on the results of an internal performance review over the past 6 months, and considering that Miss Eleanor Vance, COO of Market Development, has made several ineffective decisions that have hindered the corporation's restructuring progress, the executive board has unanimously agreed to terminate all of Miss Vance's duties, effective immediately. A few sharp, quiet intakes of breath could be heard around the table. No one dared to breathe too loudly. No one dared to look me in the eye for more than 2 seconds. I placed the spoon down on the saucer, as slowly as if I had just heard a story that had nothing to do with me. The first feeling that hit me wasn't pain, nor was it shock. It was amusement. It was so amusing that I almost wanted to burst out laughing right there in the middle of the conference room. A woman who had been with the company for 6 days, relying on the name of the man sitting at the center of the table, dared to deliver my termination notice on the very ground that had belonged to me from the beginning. Seeing my silence, Chloe grew more confident. She walked over and placed the termination letter in front of me. The paper was printed on crisp letterhead with a red seal, the ink still smelling fresh. She tapped the first page lightly with a nude-polished fingertip. "Miss Vance, I believe you heard me clearly." I picked up the paper, glancing over the meaningless words: termination of duties, revocation of access privileges, handover of files within 30 minutes. Security will provide assistance in escorting you from the building if necessary. Sounded professional. Chloe leaned down a little closer, just enough for her perfume to invade the air around me. "Your office will be taken over by someone else starting now." I hope you'll cooperate to make this civilized. I folded the letter and set it back on the table, then turned to look at the man in the center. Daniel finally looked up, and our eyes met. Some marriages don't die when a third person appears. They die the moment two people look at each other and see only calculations. His eyes were no longer those of the husband who had once told me that no matter what happened, he would always be on my side. They were the eyes of a CEO weighing profits and losses, the eyes of a man who had risen on his wife's family money and foundation and was beginning to believe he was truly the master of it all. I asked, my voice so calm it surprised even me. Is this your decision, Dan? He was silent for 2 seconds. 2 seconds, long enough for me to remember the first year we were married. Back then, he had nothing but his decent looks, a few impressive business plans, and an ambition so vast it made my heart race. My father had tried to stop me. He said that men who are excessively humble when they have nothing are the most unpredictable when they finally gain power. I had argued with him. I trusted my intuition. I trusted in love, and for 5 years, I stood in the shadows, clearing the path, supporting him, and yielding the spotlight so he could sit in the chair he occupied today. Daniel spoke, his voice deep but dry. This is a decision from the executive board. You should take some time off. The company needs a change. I nodded slowly. A change. He tightened his grip on the pen. Your management style is no longer a good fit. I let out a soft laugh. No longer a good fit. What a beautiful phrase, as beautiful as wrapping a knife in velvet before stabbing someone with it. Chloe, leaning one hand on the table, interjected immediately. Let's be honest, Miss Vance. The era of old-fashioned people like you is over. The corporation needs a breath of fresh air, new thinking. If you have any self-respect left, you should leave quietly. A department head near the end of the table coughed, as if he had choked on something. The tension in the room was so thick that a single spark could set it all ablaze. I leaned back in my chair, looking at each face before me. So many people who had respectfully called me Miss Vance, who had asked for my signature on every project, who had bowed their heads at every year-end party. Today, they sat as still as statues. No one spoke up. No one objected. Some had even started glancing at Chloe with the speculative eyes of someone looking to curry favor with a new master. I asked another question, my gaze still on Daniel. And the Montauk Point project? It was a luxury coastal resort development in the Hamptons, a capital investment of nearly $500 million, Vance Sterling's crown jewel for the next 3 years. I had personally negotiated the deals, acquired the land, handled the legal framework, and secured the bank financing. In other words, without me, that project was just a pile of lifeless paper. Chloe smiled, cutting in to answer. The Montauk Point project is now under my direct supervision. I looked at her, then at Daniel. He didn't deny it. In that instant, something inside me finally died. There was no noise, no bloodshed, just a tiny snapping sound, like the last thread connecting me to my past life had suddenly broken. I stood up. Immediately, 2 security guards from outside opened the door and stepped in. They had clearly been instructed beforehand. One of them bowed his head awkwardly, the other avoided my gaze. Chloe crossed her arms, her triumphant expression clear. You see? The company has already made preparations for your swift departure. I looked at the 2 guards, then back at the conference table, a strange sense of calm settling over me. In the stillness, I could hear my own heartbeat. Not fast, not erratic, but steady and firm, like a drum signaling the start of a new act. I picked up my coffee cup and took one last sip. It was cold, bitter, and acrid, just like my 5-year marriage at this moment. I set the cup down. You want me to leave? Fine. I spoke quietly, but the entire room heard me. But before I go, I want to hear you answer one question, straight from your mouth. Daniel frowned. I don't think that's necessary right now. I smiled. Oh, it is. I stepped away from my chair, walking slowly toward the center of the table. The 2 guards made a move to block me, but stopped, for some reason. Perhaps it was because, from the very beginning, I had shown no signs of being a person who had just been fired. I stood directly in front of Daniel, the distance between us less than an arm's length. I looked him straight in the eye and asked slowly. Do you really think that from today, Vance Sterling belongs to you? The color in his face shifted slightly, but I saw it the reaction of a man whose deepest secret had been touched. Chloe laughed. Miss Vance, you're in shock. Dan is the CEO, and I've been appointed to manage the strategic project. The truth is right in front of you. Don't you get it yet? I turned my head to look at her. This time, I smiled fully, a smile that silenced the entire room. You're right. From my handbag, I took out a small, black velvet box, the size of my palm. Chloe narrowed her eyes, a greedy light flashing within them. Daniel, however, went pale. It was only for a moment, but it was long enough for me to know he remembered what was in my hand. I ran my fingers over the smooth velvet surface of the box, feeling the breaths in the cold room grow heavier. Then I spoke, each word clear and slow, like a knife slicing away the final layer of deceit. You were bold enough to deliver my termination notice in front of the entire leadership team. I looked directly at Chloe. So I'm sure you're bold enough to hear the rest of this. My hand flicked open the box. Inside, a black authority key gleamed under the conference room lights. Daniel shot to his feet, his face drained of all color. And for the first time that morning, I felt a sharp, steel-like cold rise within me. Because I knew, from this moment, things were only just beginning. The black authority key lay in my palm, a small, unassuming piece of metal. But I knew its true value was enough to make everyone in this room change their allegiance in less than a minute. The overhead lights reflected off its matte surface in a cold streak, just like the look in my eyes as I stared directly at Daniel Harris. I saw his throat move as he swallowed, his hand gripping the pen tighter, his fingertips turning white. It was the instinctual reaction of a man seeing something he had always hoped would never appear before him. Chloe was the first to break the silence. Miss Vance, what are you doing with that? I didn't answer her right away. I turned the key in my hand, slowly, as if considering which words to say first. In that vast conference room, the air felt so compressed that a single deep breath could have shattered it. I could hear my own heartbeat, but it wasn't racing. It was the steady beat of someone who had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. I looked at Daniel. Do you remember this? He didn't answer, only his eyes flickered slightly. Chloe frowned. This is a company meeting, not a stage for your personal drama. I laughed. You're absolutely right. I walked over to the central control panel, set against the glass wall on the right. The two guards at the door exchanged a glance and instinctively took 2 steps back, as if they too understood that something was changing that they couldn't possibly stop. I held the key up to the identification sensor. A light blinked once, then turned green. A soft click echoed through the room. Instantly, the large LED screen at the front lit up. A stream of data began to scroll. My name appeared on the top line. Eleanor Vance, founding shareholder. Ownership, 51%, supreme voting rights. Active. The entire room seemed to freeze. I turned back to face everyone. No one was pretending to read their documents anymore. No one dared to look down. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Chloe took a step back. That's impossible, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel shot up from his chair. Eleanor, he said my name as if addressing a stranger. I tilted my head, looking at him. You just said I should take some time off, didn't you? He didn't answer. I turned to the entire room. I think the person who needs a break now isn't me. The head of HR stood up reflexively. Miss Vance, this is. I held up a hand to stop him. No need for explanations. I walked directly to the center of the conference table, to the spot that, for 5 years, I had deliberately avoided to protect the ego of the man I once trusted. Today, I stood there not to reclaim a seat, but because I had decided I no longer needed to yield. I looked at Daniel. Do you want me to continue? He clenched his hands. Eleanor, we don't need to make this a scene. I laughed. Not make a scene? I turned back to the screen. With another command, a different document appeared. A list of 4 stock transfer agreements, all signed within the last 7 days. The name of the recipient was clearly displayed, Nathaniel Reed, Chloe Reed's older brother. A series of gasps rippled through the room. Chloe's face turned ashen. That's a strategic partnership. I looked back at her. A strategic partnership? I pressed another command. New text appeared. Receiving company, Eastgate Capital LLC. Registered capital, $100,000. Date of incorporation, 12 days ago. I stared directly at her. A company with $100,000 in capital is going to acquire a stake in a $500 million project? Chloe was speechless. Daniel spoke quickly. That was a preliminary step before raising capital. I nodded. A very thorough preparation. I took a step closer to him. So thorough that you signed it without a resolution from the board of shareholders. A few people in the room began to stand, not because they wanted to speak, but because they no longer dared to sit. I looked at each of their faces. I think everyone here knows what this means. No one answered. I turned to the legal department. Mark. He stood up immediately. Yes, Miss Vance. From this moment on, all 4 of these stock transfer agreements are suspended. He nodded instantly. Understood. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. Eleanor. I looked at him. You just signed 4 unauthorized contracts, I said, enunciating each word. Do you want me to pretend I didn't see them? He lowered his voice. We can discuss this privately. I shook my head. No. I turned to Chloe. You told me I had 30 minutes to leave the company. She said nothing, just stared at me as if I had emerged from a place she could never have imagined. But before I leave, I continued, I also have a decision to announce. I turned back to the screen. A new line of text appeared. Decision to temporarily suspend the duties of Vice President of Operations, Chloe Reed, effective immediately. The room held its breath. Chloe took another step back. You don't have the right. I cut her off. I do. I looked directly at her. And I just used it. Daniel stepped quickly in front of me. Eleanor, you're taking this too far. I looked at him. Not yet. I raised my hand and placed the authority key on the conference table. It made a dry, sharp sound. This is just the beginning. Outside the conference room doors, I heard the hurried footsteps of internal security running over not to escort me out, but to await new orders. I knew that feeling well. When power shifts, people change direction faster than the wind. I turned back to the entire room. I'd like to know, I said, speaking each word clearly, if there is anyone else here who still thinks I should leave this building within the next 30 minutes? No one answered. Not a single person. Only the air conditioning continued to hum steadily, as if nothing had happened at all. I smiled. Good. I turned to face Daniel one last time that morning. Now, it's your turn. Daniel stood opposite me. The distance between us was less than 2 feet, but it was the farthest we had been in our 5 years of marriage. I could clearly see the veins standing out on his neck, the way his breath was held tight in his chest. He was no longer the man who had stood outside my house on a rainy afternoon years ago, holding a small bouquet of flowers, promising to spend his life being worthy of me. The man before me now was a CEO desperately trying to hold on to power that had just slipped through his fingers. He said, his voice low enough for the whole room to hear, Eleanor, calm down. I looked at him without a word. He lowered his voice even more. We can talk about this privately. I shook my head. There's no need. I turned and walked back to the central control panel. Once again, I placed my hand on the sensor. The screen switched to high-level administrative mode. Data that only I had been able to see for the past 3 years now appeared before the entire leadership team. Access logs, financial approval chains, signature authorization lists. I pointed to the third line. Do you see this? Daniel didn't answer. I read each word aloud. Final approval for all expenditures over $20 million belongs to the controlling shareholder. I paused for a beat. Which is me. The room was dead silent. A VP of finance shot up from his chair reflexively. Miss Vance, until now, I turned to him. Until now, I haven't used it, I said softly. That doesn't mean I don't have it. I turned back to Daniel. You signed 4 stock transfer agreements without the approval of the controlling shareholder. I spoke slowly. Do you know what that means? He clenched his fists. It was a strategic decision. I laughed. Strategic? I entered another command. A financial dossier appeared. A list of overseas wire transfers from the last 3 months. A figure in red stood out on the screen, $5 million. Recipient, Nathaniel Reed. I looked at Chloe. Her face was ashen. I didn't know about that. I tilted my head. You didn't know. I switched to the next screen. A list of intermediary accounts. Name of the person who confirmed the transfer, Daniel Harris. A murmur went through the room. Daniel took a step toward me. Eleanor, you're going too far. I stared him down. You think I'm going too far? I rested my hand on the edge of the table. You wired company money to an external account without the approval of the controlling shareholder. I spoke each word slowly. What do you think I should do? He didn't answer. Chloe suddenly stepped forward. That was an investment for an ancillary project. I turned to her. Which ancillary project? She hesitated for a second, then said quickly, a logistics project. I laughed. A logistics company with a registered capital of $100,000? No one said anything. The air in the conference room was so thick you could slice it. I walked toward the chairman's seat, the one that had belonged to Daniel. I stopped beside it, not sitting down, but placing my hand on its back. I have another announcement. I turned to the legal department. Mark. He stood up instantly. Yes, Miss Vance. From this moment, all bank accounts related to these stock transfer agreements are to be frozen, effective immediately. He nodded. Understood. Daniel took another step. Eleanor. His voice was louder. For the first time that morning, I heard genuine panic in his voice. I am the CEO. I looked at him. Correct. I nodded. But I am the controlling shareholder. The room was silent as a tomb. I continued, do you want me to read the relevant clause from the company charter? He said nothing. Chloe suddenly laughed, a strained, unnatural sound. Miss Vance, do you think just because you hold the shares, you can do whatever you want? I turned to her. No, I said calmly. But it's enough to keep from being fired from my own company. A few people in the room couldn't help but let out a quiet chuckle before immediately falling silent. I looked around the entire room. I believe everyone understands what's happening. No one objected. No one spoke up. I turned back to Daniel. Do you still want me to leave the building within 30 minutes? He didn't answer, just stood there, motionless. I looked him straight in the eye. Or would you now like to explain to the board why you signed unauthorized stock transfer agreements? He took a deep breath. Eleanor, his voice dropped. We're husband and wife. I was silent for a second, just 1 second. But it was long enough to remember all the nights I sat alone in my office until midnight, perfecting documents for him to sign. All the times I declined invitations from partners just to protect his image. All the times I stood in the background so he could stand in the spotlight and receive all the praise. I looked at him. Yes, I said quietly. We were husband and wife. The room held its breath. Chloe stared at me. Daniel stared at me. I opened my handbag, took out a thin file folder, and placed it on the conference table. The sound of the paper hitting the polished wood was soft but clear. I brought this with me this morning, I said. I just hadn't planned on using it so soon. Daniel looked at the folder, his expression changing. Eleanor. I pushed the folder toward him. Sign it. He didn't touch it. I said each word distinctly. Divorce papers. The room felt like it had imploded in silence. Not a sound, not a word, only the eyes of dozens of people fixed on the papers lying in the middle of the table. Daniel stared at me, his eyes losing their composure for the first time. Eleanor, his voice was hoarse. Are you serious? I nodded. Perfectly serious. I looked him straight in the eye. Just as serious as your decision to fire me moments ago. Chloe took a step back. She looked from the divorce papers to Daniel, then to me. Real panic began to show in her eyes. I closed my handbag and looked around the room. I believe today's meeting should continue as scheduled, I said calmly. But first, I paused for a beat, there are a few positions that need to be reviewed. The moment I said, there are a few positions that need to be reviewed, the tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. No one was looking at their phones anymore, no one was pretending to take notes. All eyes were on me, no longer with curiosity, but with the wariness of people waiting to see where the storm would strike next. I stood straight before the conference table, my hand resting lightly on its cool surface, feeling my heartbeat remain as steady as it had been all morning. That told me I was completely clear-headed. Not acting out of anger, not out of pain, but because I had been waiting for this day for far too long. Daniel was still standing opposite me. The divorce papers lay between us like a wound that could not be stitched. He didn't touch them, but he didn't push them away either. I knew he was calculating. He was always like that. When he was in love with me, he calculated how to make me happy. When he became CEO, he calculated how to hold on to power. And now, he was calculating which to save first. He said, Eleanor, you can't do this in the middle of a board meeting. I looked at him. Can't I? I smiled faintly. You just fired me in the middle of a board meeting. A few people lowered their heads, others shifted in their chairs. No one dared to say a word. Chloe, standing behind Daniel, clasped her hands together. I could see her nails digging into her palms, turning the skin white, but she still tried to maintain a calm facade. She said, Miss Vance, personal matters shouldn't be brought into the workplace. I turned to her. Personal matters? I laughed. Is wiring company money to your brother a personal matter? The room fell silent. Chloe froze. I had nothing to do with that. I tilted my head. Nothing to do with it? I lightly touched the control panel. A bank statement appeared. Recipient. Nathaniel Reed. Internal transfer confirmation, Chloe Reed. Her face went pale. I was just following orders. I asked, very slowly, whose orders? She turned to look at Daniel. He said nothing, just stood there. I nodded. I see. I turned to the legal department. Mark. He stood up instantly. Yes, Miss Vance. From this moment, Chloe Reed's high-level access to the financial system is suspended. He nodded. Understood. Chloe took a step forward. You don't have the right to do that. I looked straight at her. I do. I paused for a beat. And I just did. No one in the room dared to breathe too loudly. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning from the ceiling like wind blowing down a long corridor. I walked slowly toward the chairman's seat again. This time, I didn't stop. I pulled the chair out and sat down. Not because I needed that chair, but because the time had come for me to stop yielding. Daniel watched me sit in that seat, his eyes darkening. I knew he understood the meaning of this act. It wasn't an impulsive gesture, it was a declaration. He said, Eleanor, you're pushing things too far. I looked at him. Too far? I asked. Do you think I should have just stood by and let you transfer the rest of the company's shares? He clenched his fists. That wasn't going to happen. I touched the screen. Another contract appeared. His signature, the internal confirmation stamp. Receiving company. Eastgate Capital. I looked at him. Do you want me to read the rest? He remained silent. I turned to the entire room. I think everyone has seen enough. No one objected. No one spoke up. The VP of Operations stood up. Miss Vance, if this is true, it's a serious violation of the company charter. I nodded. Correct. I continued, and for that reason, I placed my hands on the table. I am officially announcing my second decision. I looked directly at Daniel. To temporarily suspend all of your financial signing authorities as CEO. The room froze. No one had expected me to move that quickly. Daniel took a step forward. Eleanor. For the first time, his voice cracked with a loss of control. I am still the CEO. I looked at him. Correct, I nodded. But you no longer have the authority to sign checks. A few people in the room exchanged glances. I saw the shift clearly. The very familiar shift in the world of business. When power moves, loyalty moves with it. Chloe took another step back. She whispered, Dan. Daniel didn't look at her. He looked at me. Eleanor, what do you want? I was silent for a second, just 1 second. Then I said, I want you to explain. He stared at me. I went on, explain why you signed a stock transfer agreement to her brother's company. He didn't answer. I continued, explain why you wired company money to an external account without approval. He still didn't answer. I asked once more, explain why you were trying to fire the controlling shareholder of the company. The room was as silent as a grave. Daniel stood motionless. I looked at him. Do you have anything else to say? He took a deep breath. Eleanor, his voice dropped. Let's go home and talk. I shook my head. No, I said clearly. This needs to be said here. Chloe suddenly spoke up, her voice loud. Dan did it for the good of the company. I turned to her. The company? I smiled. Or for you? She stiffened. I looked her straight in the eye. I think we should check a few more things. I touched the screen. A new folder opened. Folder name. Related personal assets. Owners, Daniel Harris, Chloe Reed. A real stir went through the room this time. I said slowly, I think everyone will be interested in this part. The moment the folder name Related Personal Assets appeared on the large screen, the atmosphere in the room plunged to a new low. It was no longer the tense silence from when I had revealed my controlling stake, but a heavy, suffocating pressure mixed with bewilderment. I could hear the soft scrape of chairs, the dry swallow of someone near the end of the table. I knew they were beginning to understand that this was no longer a simple internal dispute. This had become a public audit. I didn't speak immediately. I let the screen scroll for a few seconds. The data appeared line by line. List of assets. 2 resort villas in the Hamptons, a 3-story townhouse in the West Village, a luxury riverside condo in Brooklyn. Registered owner, Chloe Reed. Daniel took a step forward. Eleanor, his voice was strained. That's enough. I turned to look at him. Enough? I asked softly. Are you sure? He looked at me, his eyes no longer holding the calm composure from the start of the meeting. I recognized it immediately. When a man starts to lose control of his gaze, it means he's starting to lose control of the game. Chloe said loudly, those are my personal assets. I nodded. Correct. I pressed another command. A different data table appeared. Source of funds for payment. Transferring account name, Daniel Harris. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Chloe staggered back a step. It's not like that. I looked at her. It's not? I moved to the next page. The transfer dates were clearly listed, each one perfectly matching the company's internal expenditures at the same time. The CFO stood up abruptly. Miss Vance, those amounts match the expense codes for the Q2 ancillary project investments. I nodded. Correct. I turned to Daniel. Do you care to explain? He said nothing. The air in the room felt thick. I saw every gaze shift. The people who had been silent all morning no longer dared to look at Daniel. This was something I was familiar with. In business, people aren't loyal to individuals, they are loyal to power. Chloe said hastily, Dan was just helping me invest. I looked at her. With company money? She was speechless. I continued, or with his own? She didn't answer. Daniel moved closer to me. Eleanor, he said quietly, we don't need to do this. I looked at him. We don't? I asked. You fired me in the middle of a board meeting. I paused. You wired company money out. I went on. You transferred company shares to her family's shell corporation. I looked him straight in the eye. Where exactly do you think I should have stopped? He was silent. I turned to the entire room. I think everyone should know one more thing. I touched the screen. A new folder opened. Folder name, travel expenses. List of flights, list of hotels, list of internal payments. I read slowly. Boston, Spain, Singapore, Miami. All business trips for the CEO. I paused, then continued, but the person traveling with him was not me. The room was dead silent. Chloe turned pale. That was work. I laughed. Work? I switched to the next screen. A photo of a hotel bill. Room type, King Suite. Registered guests, Daniel Harris, Chloe Reed. A few people in the room turned away. No one said anything, but everyone understood what this meant. Daniel said urgently, Eleanor, his voice almost pleading, let's talk privately. I looked at him. No, I said clearly. You just said it was work. He was silent. I looked straight at him. Or do you now want to say it was personal? Chloe suddenly said loudly, Miss Vance, you have no right to disclose someone's private life. I turned to her. Private life? I asked. Traveling on the company's dime is private life? She was speechless. The head of the legal department stood up. Miss Vance, if these are internal expenses, this constitutes a misuse of company funds. I nodded. Correct. I looked at Daniel. Do you want me to continue? He didn't answer. I placed my hand on the table. I think that's enough. I turned to the legal department. Mark. He stood up immediately. Yes, Miss Vance. From this moment, compile a file to review all of the CEO's travel expenses for the past 3 years. He nodded instantly. Understood. Chloe took another step back. Dan. Daniel didn't look at her. He looked at me. Eleanor, his voice was very low. Do you want to destroy everything? I looked at him. No, I said calmly. I'm just taking back what belongs to me. The room was absolutely silent. I looked at each person, one by one. I think we should move on to the next decision. I touched the screen again, a new line of text appeared. Decision to convene an emergency meeting of the audit committee. The moment the words decision to convene an emergency meeting of the audit committee appeared on the large screen, the room could no longer maintain its feigned calm. The once cautious glances turned into genuine alarm. I knew they understood what this meant. When the audit committee is convened on an emergency basis, the issue is no longer an internal operational matter, it has crossed into the realm of legal scrutiny. And once that line is crossed, no one can remain a bystander. Daniel stared at the words on the screen for a long time, so long that I could hear his breathing grow heavy. I knew he was calculating. If the audit committee got involved, every document he had signed in the past week would be scrutinized, page by page. The wire transfers, the stock agreements, the disguised business trips, there would be no room left to retreat. He said, Eleanor, you don't need to go that far. I looked at him. You were about to transfer company stock without even asking me, I said slowly. So why should I have to ask you before convening the audit committee? No one in the room said a word. A few people began to sit up straighter, as if they were entering an entirely different meeting. It was no longer a quarterly review. It had become a power audit. Chloe said hastily, Miss Vance, you're misunderstanding the situation. I turned to her. Misunderstanding? She spoke quickly. It was just a preparatory step to raise capital. I nodded. Preparing to raise capital by transferring shares to your brother's company? She fell silent. Preparing to raise capital by wiring company funds to personal accounts? She took a step back and said no more. Daniel moved a little closer to me. Eleanor, his voice dropped. Let's talk privately. I looked at him. You still don't get it, do you? I said slowly. This is no longer a private matter. I turned to the executive assistant. Susan. She stood up immediately. Yes, Miss Vance. Send out the notification to convene the audit committee I continued. And attach all the documents I've just presented. She glanced at me for a second, then nodded again. Understood. The VP of Planning stood up. Miss Vance, if the audit committee gets involved, all contracts signed last week will have their execution suspended. I nodded. Correct. I turned to Daniel. Do you have any objections? He clenched his fists. Eleanor, you're destroying the company's plans. I looked at him. The company's plans? I asked. Or your plans? The room was silent. Chloe said loudly, Dan did everything for the corporation. I turned to her. For the corporation? I pressed another command. A new data table appeared. Project name. Montauk Point. Total investment, $520 million. Previous project lead. Eleanor Vance. After adjustment, Chloe Reed. I looked at her. Since when were you in charge of this project? She didn't answer. I looked at Daniel. You assigned this project to her without a resolution from the board of directors. He was silent. I continued, are you aware that this project is classified as a Tier 1 strategic asset? He was still silent. I turned to the entire room. I think everyone here knows. The VP of Investment stood up. Miss Vance, if that's the case, the transfer of project leadership is a violation of internal regulations. I nodded. Correct. I looked at Daniel. Do you have anything else to say? He took a deep breath. Eleanor, his voice dropped. I did it because I wanted to change the system. I looked at him. Change the system? I asked. Or change the people? He didn't answer. Chloe said quickly, Dan just wanted to improve operational efficiency. I looked at her. Improve efficiency by handing a $500 million project to someone who's been with the company for 6 days? She was speechless. I turned to the legal department. Mark. He stood up immediately. Yes, Miss Vance. Immediately suspend the decision to transfer leadership of the Montauk Point project. He nodded. Understood. I added, until the audit committee reaches its conclusion. He nodded again. Understood. Daniel looked at me. Eleanor, his voice grew low. Do you really want to take it this far? I looked at him. It's not me taking it this far, I said slowly. It was you. I turned back to the screen. A new line appeared. List of high-level executive powers. I placed my hand on the control panel and said, each word distinct, I am officially activating the special oversight protocol for the CEO. The room was absolutely silent. No one spoke, no one moved. All eyes were fixed on me. I looked at Daniel. Starting now, I said slowly, every decision you make must be approved by me before it becomes effective. The moment I said, every decision you make must be approved by me before it becomes effective, the room could no longer maintain its feigned silence. While not everyone spoke, I could see a clear shift in their eyes. If at first they had seen this as a private dispute between a husband and wife in leadership, they now understood it was a genuine restructuring of power. No one could remain neutral any longer. Daniel stared at me for a long time. His gaze was no longer that of a CEO conducting a meeting, but of a man who had just had the chair he thought was his pulled out from under him. I knew that feeling. I had once handed him that chair with my own hands. And now, I was taking it back with my own hands. He said, his voice dropping, Eleanor, you're only doing this because you're angry. I looked at him. You think I'm angry? He nodded slightly. You're being emotional. I let out a soft laugh. You're mistaken, I said slowly. If I were being emotional, I would have done this 3 months ago. The room fell silent. Chloe looked at me, and for the first time that morning, her eyes showed something new, fear. Not worry, not surprise, but genuine fear. She said, Miss Vance, you can't just arbitrarily restrict the CEO's authority. I turned to her. I'm not being arbitrary. I lightly touched the control panel. An internal document appeared. Company Charter. Article 7, Section 3. Special oversight powers of the controlling shareholder. I read each word aloud. In the event of a potential risk of strategic asset transfer, the controlling shareholder has the right to implement a special oversight mechanism for the CEO. I looked at her. I am acting in accordance with the charter. No one said a word. The head of HR let out a quiet sigh. I knew he had just realized what everyone else was also realizing. From the moment the authority key appeared, this entire meeting had been under my control. Daniel took another step closer to the table. Eleanor, his voice dropped. Do you really want to embarrass me in front of the entire company? I looked at him. You just embarrassed me in front of the entire company, I said softly. The difference is, you did it for power. I paused. I'm doing it for the truth. He was silent. The room was so heavy I could hear a pen drop to the floor at the far end of the table. No one bent to pick it up. No one dared to move. I turned to the finance department. Robert. He stood up immediately. Yes, Miss Vance. From now on, all payments over $1 million must be reported directly to me. He nodded instantly. Understood. Daniel looked at him, his expression changing visibly. It was the look of a man realizing he was no longer the center of the room. Chloe said quickly, Robert, you can't just follow her orders like that. Robert looked at her, then at me. Then he said very clearly, I follow the company charter. The room fell silent once more. I looked at Chloe. Do you have any other objections? She bit her lip and said nothing. I turned to Daniel. And you? He stared at me for a long moment, then said, Eleanor, his voice slowing. I know what you're thinking. I didn't speak. He continued. But you don't understand the whole story. I looked at him. Then tell me. He took a deep breath. I did it to save the company. A few people in the room looked up. I looked at him. Save the company? He nodded. The Montauk Point project needed additional funding. I asked. $500 million wasn't enough? He said quickly, not enough for the cash flow. I looked at him. Or not enough for you to transfer more shares? He was silent. Chloe stepped forward. Dan was just trying to find a strategic partner. I turned to her. A strategic partner who happens to be your brother? She didn't answer. I looked directly at Daniel. Do you think I don't know how much the value of that coastal land in the Hamptons is appreciating? He said nothing. I continued. Do you think I don't know where the true value of the Montauk Point project lies? He clenched his fists. I said slowly, you weren't raising capital. I looked him straight in the eye. You were selling the company. The room was absolutely silent. No one breathed. No one moved. Chloe's face turned ashen. That's not true. I turned to her. Are you sure? I touched the screen. An internal memo appeared. Title, Proposal for Transfer of Controlling Interest in the Montauk Point Project. Author, Daniel Harris. The room froze once again. I looked at Daniel. Do you want me to read the rest? He didn't answer. I placed my hand on the table. I think everyone understands. I looked around the entire room. From this moment on, I said, enunciating each word, the Montauk Point project returns to my direct management. When I finished the sentence, the Montauk Point project returns to my direct management, the room could no longer maintain its calm facade. This was not a warning or a temporary measure. It was a definitive reclamation of power. The people who had been quietly taking notes all morning began to look up, staring directly at me. A few exchanged glances. I could see they understood what this meant. If the Montauk Point project returned to my control, the entire plan for a stealth transfer of ownership that Daniel had been preparing was effectively dead. Daniel stood motionless. He said nothing for several seconds, but I saw his throat move as he swallowed. It was the sign of a man trying to force down something immense. He said, Eleanor, you can't just make that decision on your own. I looked at him. I can, I said calmly. And I just did. Chloe stepped forward. Miss Vance, you're disrupting the project's progress. I turned to her. The project's progress? I asked. Or the stock transfer's progress? She froze, saying nothing more. I turned to the investment department. David. He stood up at once. Yes, Miss Vance. From this moment, all project files for Montauk Point are to be sent directly to me. He nodded instantly. Understood. Daniel looked at David, his eyes darkening. I understood that look. It was the gaze of a man realizing he was no longer the center of command. He said, his voice low, Eleanor, you've gone too far. I looked at him. No, I said slowly. I'm just returning to my rightful place. The room was silent. The head of legal shifted in his seat. I could see the change in his demeanor. It was no longer the attitude of someone waiting for orders from the CEO, but of someone waiting for confirmation from me. Chloe said loudly, Dan is the legal CEO. I turned to her. Correct, I nodded. But he no longer has decision-making power over strategic projects. She bit her lip and fell silent. I turned back to Daniel. Do you have anything else to say? He was quiet for a moment, then he said, very slowly, Eleanor. His voice was completely different from the start of the meeting. It was no longer the voice of a man giving orders, but of someone trying to hold on to something he was about to lose. Do you really not trust me at all? I looked at him. A simple question, but it brought back so many memories. The nights I spent editing reports for him to sign. The times I stood backstage, watching him accept the Young Entrepreneur of the Year award. The times I heard him tell the press that his success was due to the team, never once mentioning me. I said very softly, I used to. The room was silent. He looked at me. I continued, but you used that trust to move company assets. He didn't answer. Chloe said hastily. There was no transfer of assets. I turned to her. I think we should look at one more document. I touched the screen. A new folder opened. Folder name, Memorandum of Understanding. Partner name, Eastgate Capital, proposed transfer percentage, 30%. A new wave of murmurs went through the room. I looked at Daniel. Are you still going to say this was just preparing to raise capital? He didn't answer. I continued. 30% of a strategic project. I paused. You call that raising capital? Chloe's face was pale. That's a development partnership. I looked at her. Development by transferring control? She was silent. I turned to the entire room. I think everyone understands what this means. The VP of Investments stood up. Miss Vance, if this agreement were signed, the controlling interest in the project would shift. I nodded. Correct. I looked at Daniel. When were you planning to sign this? He was silent. I pressed on. After I left the company? He didn't answer. I looked him straight in the eye. Or after you had me fired. The room was as silent as a tomb. I placed my hand on the table. I think it's time we clarify one more thing. I touched the screen again. A new line of data appeared. Name of beneficiary account for contingency payout. Account holder, Chloe Reed. Projected payout amount, $10 million. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. I looked at Chloe. Would you like to explain? She took a step back. That was a project success bonus agreement. I laughed. A project bonus before the project contracts are even signed? She said nothing more. I turned to Daniel. Do you still want to say this was for the good of the company? He looked at me, silent. I nodded. I understand. I turned to the legal department. Mark. He stood up immediately. Yes, Miss Vance. Prepare a file to transfer all of this documentation to the audit committee. He nodded. Understood. I added. And send a copy to the internal audit department. He nodded again. Understood. I looked around the entire room. I don't think this meeting can conclude just yet, I said slowly. Because there is still one more thing I have yet to announce. When I said, there is still one more thing I have yet to announce, the atmosphere in the room changed once again. No one saw this as the end of a confrontation anymore. They all understood I wasn't finished. I could see every eye following my slightest movement. Someone leaned forward slightly, another put their pen down, someone else even seemed to forget to breathe evenly. I knew they were waiting, not just for an answer, but to see where the final boundary of this meeting lay. Daniel stood motionless. He said nothing, but his gaze was no longer on me. He was looking down at the divorce papers that had been sitting on the table between us all morning. I knew he understood that what I was about to say was no longer about corporate governance. I opened my handbag, took out a brown manila envelope, and placed it on the table. No one spoke, but I heard the soft scrape of a chair from the back of the room. I knew they were trying to get a better look. I said, I think this needs to be said in front of the entire leadership team. Daniel looked up at me. Eleanor, his voice dropped. That's not necessary. I looked at him. It's very necessary. I opened the envelope and took out a thin stack of papers. Not thick, but enough to make my hands feel a little cold as I touched them. I had been holding on to this for 3 weeks, and today was the first time I was putting it on the table publicly. I turned the documents to face the room. The results of a DNA test. The room froze. Chloe's face turned ashen. Daniel stood, stunned. No one spoke. I looked directly at him. I think you should read it. He didn't touch the papers, just stared at me. His eyes, for the first time that morning, were filled with genuine panic. Not because of stocks, not because of the project, but because of this. He said, his voice strained, Eleanor, what are you doing? I looked at him. I'm telling the truth. I turned to the entire room. I'm 3 months pregnant. The room was as silent as a tomb. No one moved, no one breathed. I continued. But the baby is not your son. A few people almost shot up from their chairs, reflexively. Chloe took a sharp step back. Daniel stood frozen. He looked at me as if he couldn't comprehend what he had just heard. Eleanor, his voice almost broke. What did you say? I looked him straight in the eye. I said, I emphasized each word, the baby is not your son. The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out. No more humming AC, no more shifting chairs, only silence. I placed the test results on the table. Do you want to see? He didn't touch them. Chloe stared at me, her eyes wide, all her earlier confidence gone. She said, that's impossible. I turned to her. Correct, I said calmly. It is impossible. I paused for a beat. Because I'm not pregnant. The room nearly exploded in silence. The CFO blurted out, what did you say? I looked at him. I'm not pregnant. I turned back to Daniel. I just wanted to see your reaction. He stared at me, speechless, his eyes completely losing control for the first time that morning. I continued, and now I've seen it. Chloe looked from Daniel to me. She said quickly, you've taken this joke too far. I looked at her. I'm not joking. I tapped the papers. These are his test results. The room fell silent once more. I looked directly at Daniel. I scheduled a comprehensive health checkup for you 3 weeks ago. He said nothing. I continued, the results show that you're infertile. A few people in the room seemed to hold their breath. Chloe's face was now truly ashen. She looked at Daniel, then at me, unable to speak. I placed my hand on the table. I think this needs to be made clear. I looked straight at Daniel. Because you told my family that I was the one who couldn't have children. The room was dead silent. I continued. You told my mother that the fault was mine. My voice remained calm, but I knew everyone could hear what lay beneath that calmness. You let me take all the blame. Daniel said nothing. No denial, no explanation. He just stood there. I looked at him. I stayed silent for 3 years. I paused. Then, enunciating each word, I said, but today, I'm not staying silent anymore. The moment the words I'm not staying silent anymore left my lips, the conference room plunged into a profound silence. It wasn't the tense quiet from when I had revealed my shareholdings or the transfer agreements. It was something much heavier. I knew everyone in this room had just heard something they never expected. For years, they had likely assumed the family matters between Daniel and me were private. But today, they understood it was no longer private. It was part of the power dynamic whose every shattered piece they were now witnessing fall before their eyes. Daniel remained still, not saying a word. His gaze was no longer on me but had dropped to the surface of the table. I could see his hands were clenched into tight fists. I knew he was trying to maintain his composure, but I also knew he understood. I had just severed a thread he always believed would never be mentioned in front of others. Chloe stood behind him, her face deathly pale. She no longer had the confident air from the start of the meeting. Her eyes darted from me to Daniel, then to the screen, as if searching for an escape route in the soulless data. But this time, no numbers could save her. The head of HR stood up slowly. Miss Vance, this matter. He trailed off, unsure how to continue. I looked at him. This is not a private matter, I said clearly. This is the reason I remained silent for the past 3 years. The room was still. I turned to Daniel. You told my family I couldn't conceive. I spoke slowly. You told my mother I wasn't fit to be a wife. My voice remained calm, but that very calmness made everyone in the room afraid to move. You knew your own medical results. Daniel closed his eyes for a second, then opened them, but he still said nothing. I looked at him. I stayed silent because I thought marriage was a matter between 2 people. I paused. But you used that silence to push me out of my own family. Chloe took a step forward. Miss Vance, this has nothing to do with the company. I turned to her. It has everything to do with it, I said clearly. Because that story is the very reason he wanted me out of my current position. She froze, unable to say more. I turned to the entire room. I think everyone should know, I said slowly. 2 months ago, he asked me to step down from the board of directors. A few people looked up immediately. The reason he gave, I continued, was that I needed to rest and prepare for childbirth. The room was silent. I looked at Daniel. Do you remember? He didn't answer. I went on. You knew perfectly well I wasn't pregnant. I placed my hand on the table. But you still used that lie to try to change the power structure within this company. The CFO stood up. Miss Vance, if that's the case, it constitutes providing misleading information to the board of directors. I nodded. Correct. I turned to Daniel. Do you care to explain? He was still silent. I looked at him. Or would you like me to play the minutes from last week's meeting? He looked up at me, his eyes filled with exhaustion. Eleanor, his voice was very low. Don't do this. I looked at him. You did it to me first, I said softly. For 3 years. The room was utterly still. No one spoke. No one moved. I turned to the screen and lightly touched the control panel. An audio file appeared. Title, Minutes from the Internal Board Meeting. I said, I think everyone should hear this. I pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the conference room. Eleanor needs to take an extended leave for personal health reasons. The air in the room seemed to congeal. His voice continued from the recording. I propose we temporarily transfer leadership of the Montauk Point project to Miss Reed. The recording stopped. I turned off the screen and looked at him. Do you have anything else to say? He didn't answer. Chloe took a step back. Her eyes were filled with genuine panic. I turned to the legal department. Mark. He stood up at once. Yes, Miss Vance. Add this to the file for the audit committee. He nodded. Understood. I added. And send a copy to the internal audit department. He nodded again. Understood. I looked around the entire room. I believe it's time to announce the next decision. I touched the screen one more time. A new line of text appeared. Motion to recommend the temporary suspension of Daniel Harris from the position of CEO to facilitate an internal investigation. The room held its breath. No one spoke. No one moved. I looked directly at him. Do you still wish to continue this meeting? The moment my question, do you still wish to continue this meeting? Hung in the air, the vast conference room fell into a void so deep. I could hear my own heartbeat. No one dared to speak first, no one dared to look at anyone else. All eyes were fixed on Daniel. Not because they wanted to side with him, but because they understood that from this moment on, his answer would determine the future of the entire corporation. Daniel stood for a long time. He didn't sit, didn't move, just stood there like a man trying to keep his balance on the edge of a cliff, unsure of how deep the drop below was. I could see his hands were still clenched, but this time it wasn't out of anger. It was as if he was trying to hold on to the last thing he had left. He said, his voice very low, Eleanor, are you really going to suspend me? I looked at him. It's not what I want, I said slowly. It's what the situation demands. The room was silent. He looked at me. You know how this will affect the company. I nodded. I do. I paused. But I also know that if I don't do this, the company will lose far more. Chloe stepped forward. Miss Vance, you can't make a decision like this on your own. I turned to her. I'm not on my own. I touched the screen. The shareholder list appeared. My name was at the top. Ownership. 51%. I looked at her. I am representing the controlling shareholder. She froze, saying nothing more. The head of legal stood up slowly. Miss Vance, if we are to proceed with this motion, we need to draw up the minutes immediately. I nodded. Correct. I turned to the executive assistant. Susan. She stood up at once. Yes, Miss Vance. Prepare the meeting minutes. She nodded. Understood. The atmosphere in the room changed palpably. It shifted from a tense debate to a formal procedure. I saw everyone begin to adjust their posture. Some reopened their files, others put pen to paper. They were no longer bystanders, they were now part of the process. Daniel looked at me. Eleanor, his voice dropped. You don't have to do this. I looked at him. I have to. He shook his head slightly. I can explain. I asked, explain what? He was silent for a second, then said, I never intended to sell the company. I looked at him. Then what were you planning to do with the 30% contract for the Montauk Point project? He didn't answer immediately. The whole room waited. He said, I was planning to maintain control. I looked at him. Maintain control for whom? He didn't answer. Chloe said quickly, Dan was just trying to protect the project. I turned to her. Protected by transferring shares to your family's company? She was speechless. I turned back to Daniel. Do you have anything else to explain? He looked at me for a long time, then said, I did it because I thought you were going to leave the company. The room was silent. I looked at him. Why would you think that? He didn't answer right away. Then he said, because I thought you wouldn't stay. I asked again, why? He looked at me. Because of our family situation? I let out a soft laugh. Our family situation? I asked. Or because you wanted me to leave? He was silent. I looked at him. I never said I was going to leave the company. He said nothing. Chloe stepped forward. Dan just wanted to stabilize the management. I turned to her. Stabilize it by replacing me? She didn't answer. I turned to the entire room. I think everyone has heard enough. The VP of Investments stood up. Miss Vance, given the information presented, the motion to recommend the temporary suspension of the CEO is reasonable. The CFO nodded. I agree. The head of legal added, I also agree. The atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. This was no longer just my decision. It was the decision of the collective leadership. Daniel looked at each person, one by one, his expression changing visibly. He understood what this meant. He said, very slowly, Eleanor, his voice dropping, do you really want to end things this way? I looked at him. I'm not the one ending it, I said clearly. You started this long ago. I turned to the executive assistant. Susan. She stood up at once. Yes, Miss Vance. Read the contents of the minutes. She opened her file and began to read, her voice clear, enunciating every word, every sentence. The entire room listened. I looked at Daniel one last time that morning. Do you have any final comments before we vote? The moment the question, do you have any final comments before we vote? Was asked, the room fell into a heavy silence, so thick I could hear the faint rustle of paper from the end of the table. No one spoke immediately. Not because they had no opinion, but because everyone understood that Daniel's answer now was no longer a personal explanation. It would be the final statement of a CEO, just before his authority was officially suspended. Daniel stood motionless for a long time. I could see his shoulders slump slightly. It was the first time all morning I saw him lose the familiar posture of a corporate leader, no longer the straight back, the sharp gaze, the confident voice. Right now, he looked like a man trying to hold on to the last shreds of his dignity. He said, his voice hoarse, Eleanor, are you really not going to give me a chance? I looked at him. What chance? He took a deep breath. A chance to explain to the audit committee. I said, very calmly, you will have that chance. I paused. But not from the position of CEO. The room was silent. Chloe stepped forward. Miss Vance, you're going too far. I turned to her. I am following procedure, I said clearly. And you will also have to provide an explanation. She froze, saying nothing more. I turned to the entire room. I believe everyone has heard sufficient information. The head of legal stood up. Miss Vance, according to internal regulations, we can proceed with the vote immediately. I nodded. Correct. I turned to the executive assistant. Susan. She stood up at once. Yes, Miss Vance. Prepare for the vote. She nodded. Understood. The atmosphere in the room shifted one last time, from silent anticipation to silent resolution. I saw everyone adjust their posture. Some put their pens down, others exchanged quick glances, before looking forward again. This was no longer a moment for emotions, it was a moment for choices. Daniel looked at each person, one by one, his gaze lingering on the familiar faces. The people who had worked with him for years, the people who had stood behind him in so many important meetings. But today, they were no longer standing behind him. They were facing a different choice. He said, I do not object to the vote. The room was silent. He continued, I just want to say one thing. I looked at him. Go on. He took a deep breath. I never intended to harm this company. No one said a word. He looked around the room. Everything I did was to keep the company stable. A few people looked down at the table. No one argued, no one agreed. Only silence. I looked at him. I believe you once thought that, I said softly. But what you did went too far. He didn't answer. Chloe suddenly said loudly, Dan doesn't deserve to be treated like this. I turned to her. Then who do you think does? She froze. I continued. The person who wired company money out? I paused. The person who signed an unauthorized stock transfer agreement? She couldn't say another word. I turned to the executive assistant. Susan. She looked at me. Yes, Miss Vance. Begin the vote. She nodded. Understood. She read the motion aloud. Motion to recommend the temporary suspension of Daniel Harris from the position of CEO to facilitate an internal investigation. One by one, people raised their hands. No one spoke, but each raised arm was a clear statement. I saw them all. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Everyone voted in favor. No one objected. No one abstained. The room was so quiet I could hear Susan's pen scratching as she recorded the result. She said, the motion is carried. The room was silent. Daniel stood motionless, saying nothing, showing no reaction, just staring down at the table. I looked at him. From this moment on, I said, each word distinct, you are temporarily suspended from the position of CEO. Chloe took a sharp step back. She looked at Daniel, then at me. Her eyes, for the first time that morning, were completely lost. I turned to the legal department. Mark. He stood up. Yes, Miss Vance. Prepare the official decision for the temporary handover of executive authority. He nodded. Understood. I looked around the entire room. I believe we need to proceed with the next part of this meeting. I paused. Because suspending the CEO is only the first step. The statement, suspending the CEO is only the first step, caused the room, once again, to fall into a silence as taut as a drawn bowstring. I could see every eye focused on me. No one thought this meeting was just about a single personnel change anymore. They all understood there were more steps to come, steps that would truly decide the future of this corporation. Daniel remained in the same spot. He didn't sit, didn't move, didn't speak. But I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Not anger, not defiance, but weariness. A very deep exhaustion. Chloe stood behind him, her face completely drained of color. She wasn't looking at me anymore. Her gaze shifted between the large screen and the documents on the table, as if searching for a final handhold. But there were no handholds left. I placed my hands on the table. I believe we need to address the remaining issues. The head of legal stood up immediately. Miss Vance, which matter would you like to address first? I looked at him. The temporary executive authority. He nodded. Understood. I turned to the entire room. During the CEO's suspension, the company cannot have a leadership vacuum. No one objected. No one spoke up. I continued, therefore, I am proposing a plan for temporary leadership while the audit committee conducts its investigation. The CFO stood up. Miss Vance, do you have a specific proposal? I nodded. I do. The room was silent. I looked at each person, one by one. I will personally assume temporary executive authority. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Not with surprise, but with confirmation. I knew they had considered this possibility, but hearing it stated officially still felt different. Daniel looked up at me, his gaze lingering for a long time. He said, his voice very low, Eleanor, do you really want to return to that position? I looked at him. I never left it. The room was silent. Chloe said quickly, Miss Vance can't be both the controlling shareholder and the interim executive. I turned to her. I can, I said clearly. The company charter allows it. The head of legal nodded. Correct, he said. In special circumstances, the controlling shareholder may assume temporary executive authority. Chloe froze, saying nothing more. I turned to the executive assistant. Susan. She stood up. Yes, Miss Vance. Add this to the minutes. She nodded. Understood. I looked around the entire room. I am not taking this position for power, I said slowly. I am taking it out of responsibility. No one objected. No one spoke up. The VP of Investments stood up. Miss Vance, if you assume temporary leadership, we need to establish a plan to stabilize the organization immediately. I nodded. Correct. I turned to the finance department. Robert. He stood up at once. Yes, Miss Vance. Prepare a cash flow report for the next 3 months. He nodded. Understood. I turned to the investment department. David. He stood up. Yes, Miss Vance. Temporarily halt all transfer negotiations related to the Montauk Point project. He nodded. Understood. I turned to the legal department. Mark. He stood up. Yes, Miss Vance. Prepare the file for the audit committee meeting this afternoon. He nodded. Understood. The atmosphere in the room changed markedly. From tense to focused, from confrontational to operational. I saw everyone begin to return to their familiar working state. This was the sign I had been waiting for all morning. When an organization returns to its orbit, it means the decision was the right one. Daniel looked at me for a long time. He said, his voice dropping, Eleanor, I never thought things would come to this. I looked at him. Neither did I said softly. But you brought us here. He didn't answer. Chloe stepped forward. Miss Vance, you can't just remove Dan from the company. I turned to her. I haven't done that, I said clearly. I have only suspended his duties. She continued, he's still a founder. I looked at her. Correct, I nodded. And for that reason, he will still have a chance to explain himself. The room was silent. I turned to the executive assistant. Susan. She stood up. Yes, Miss Vance. Note the effective time of the temporary leadership decision. She nodded. Understood. I looked around the entire room one more time. From this moment on, I said slowly, all executive operations of the corporation are under my direct authority. When I clearly stated, all executive operations of the corporation are under my direct authority, the conference room was no longer a battleground but a place where a new order was being confirmed. I could see the change in each person's eyes. No longer gazes of speculation or waiting, but of people adjusting their positions around a new center. I understood it. I had witnessed it many times before in previous restructurings, but never had it happen to my own marriage like this. Daniel stood motionless. He no longer objected, no longer tried to explain, no longer clung to power. He just stood there like a man who had walked a very long road and didn't know what lay ahead. I looked at him for a long time, not to claim victory, but to confirm to myself that things had truly reached a point of no return. He said, Eleanor, his voice very low, I want to speak with you privately. I looked at him. After the meeting, he nodded slightly and said nothing more. Chloe stood behind him, her gaze completely lost. I could see her hands clasped together so tightly, as if trying to maintain her balance. But what caught my attention was not her panic, but the silence of everyone else in the room. No one defended her anymore. No one sided with her anymore. That said everything. The CFO stood up. Miss Vance, do we need to make an official announcement to the entire company? I nodded. Yes. I turned to the executive assistant. Susan. She stood up. Yes, Miss Vance. Draft an internal announcement. She nodded. Understood. I continued. Make it clear that the change in temporary executive authority is effective immediately. She quickly jotted it down. Understood. The atmosphere in the room shifted to a truly functional state. I heard the rustle of paper, the scratching of pens, the soft scrape of chairs. These were the familiar sounds of an organization getting back on track, and I knew that was the most important thing right now. Daniel looked at me. Eleanor, his voice slowed. How long will you hold this position? I looked at him. Until the audit committee reaches its conclusion. He nodded slightly. So you're still giving me a chance to come back. I looked at him. I'm letting the truth decide. The room was silent. Chloe suddenly said loudly, Dan did nothing wrong. I turned to her. I have not concluded that he is guilty, I said clearly. I have only suspended his duties. She continued, but you're making everyone misunderstand. I looked at her. No, I said slowly. I'm making everyone understand correctly. The head of legal stood up. Miss Vance, we need to form a task force to coordinate with the audit committee. I nodded. Correct. I turned to him. You will lead it. He nodded at once. Understood. I added, I want the first report by the end of today. He nodded again. Understood. The atmosphere in the room grew more and more stable. The people who had been silent earlier were now actively discussing their tasks. I saw it clearly, and I knew the organization had accepted this change. Daniel looked at me again, his eyes no longer as tense as before. He said, Eleanor, his voice very soft. I'm sorry. The room was silent. No one said a word. I looked at him. Not with surprise, not with emotion, just with a deep emptiness inside me. I said, you should say that to the audit committee. He nodded very slowly and said nothing more. Chloe looked at him, then at me. Her gaze finally fell to the table. I turned to the executive assistant. Susan. She stood up. Yes, Miss Vance. Prepare to announce the conclusion of the meeting. She nodded. Understood. I looked around the entire room one last time. I believe we have completed the most important part of our work today. I paused. The rest will be handled by the audit committee. No one objected. No one spoke up. Only a confirming silence. I stood up from the chairman's seat. It was the first time that morning I had left that spot since sitting down. But this time, I didn't leave with the feeling of having to yield, but with the sense of having completed something I should have done a long time ago. I looked at Daniel. After the meeting, I said softly. We'll talk. The meeting ended when I said, we'll talk, but for me, that was when everything truly began to close. As people stood up and filed out of the room, no one spoke loudly, no one made prolonged eye contact, no one turned back to ask another question. They understood that this morning's meeting wasn't just a regular operational review. It was a milestone, a boundary, a turning point they would all remember. I remained in the conference room after almost everyone had left, until it was just me and Daniel. No more data screens, no more scratching pens, no more gazes from the leadership team. Just two people who had once been husband and wife, standing opposite each other in a room that had just witnessed it all. Daniel spoke first. Eleanor, his voice was very quiet. I never thought it would come to this. I looked at him. Neither did I said, and it was the truth. But here we are. He sat down in the nearest chair, not the chairman's seat, just a regular chair. I realized it was the first time in years I had seen him sit there. He said, I was wrong. I didn't answer right away. I walked to the table, placed my hand on its surface, and looked down at the faint fingerprints left on the glass. The marks of a very long morning. You were wrong about many things, I said. He nodded. I know, his voice was deep. I'm sorry. I looked at him. This time, I felt no anger, no pain, just a strange sense of relief. Like someone who had been carrying a heavy suitcase for years and had finally set it down. You don't need to apologize to me, I said. He looked at me. I continued, you need to apologize to yourself. He was silent for a long time, then he said, I thought if I could hold on to the company, everything else could be fixed. I looked at him. But you lost both. He didn't answer. I opened my handbag, took out the divorce papers, and placed them in front of him again. Sign them. He stared at the papers for a long time, then he picked up the pen and signed. Without another word. I looked at his signature on the paper, a signature I had seen countless times on major company contracts, but never had it made me feel so light. He put the pen down. Eleanor, his voice was faint. Will you be okay? I smiled. I've always been okay. He nodded slightly and said no more. He stood up and left the conference room first. I stayed behind for a few more minutes. Not because I needed to think, but because I wanted to look at this room one last time from my old role. A wife standing behind her husband, a woman who once thought silence was the way to keep a family together, a person who once believed sacrifice was the right thing to do. I walked out of the conference room into a brighter hallway. Sunlight streamed through the glass at the far end. I slowed my pace. Not because I was tired, but because I knew that from this day forward, my path was different. It was no longer a path walked in someone else's shadow. That afternoon, I signed my first executive order as the direct interim head of the corporation. I didn't feel like I had won a victory over anyone. I only felt like I had returned to my rightful place. A week later, the audit committee issued its preliminary findings. The stock transfer agreements were permanently voided. The misappropriated funds were referred for legal review. The Montauk Point project remained under the full control of the corporation. The management structure stabilized faster than I had expected. 3 weeks later, I received official notification from the board of directors confirming that my interim leadership role would be extended until the entire internal investigation was complete. I signed the confirmation without hesitation. Not because I wanted to hold the position longer, but because I knew my responsibility was not yet finished. A month later, I returned to my parents' old house. My mother opened the door, looked at me for a long time, and then hugged me tightly. She didn't ask any questions, didn't blame me, just held me. I knew she had been waiting for this day for a very long time. I told my mother, I'm okay now. She nodded. That was all. But for me, it was the answer I needed most. 3 months later, the corporation signed a new investment deal for the Montauk Point project with a more transparent partner. No more shadowy contracts, no more rushed decisions, no more years of silence. I stood on the top floor of the building late one afternoon, looking down at the city below. I remembered that morning in the conference room, a morning that had changed everything. Not because I was stronger than anyone else, but because I had finally dared to stand up for myself. I realized a very simple truth. There are times in a woman's life when she doesn't need to defeat anyone else, she just needs to not lose to herself. The story of one woman's journey to reclaim control of her life is not just a tale of power or business, but also a story of self-respect, clarity, and strength in marriage and life. When we dare to face the truth, protect our own values, and choose the right path, every woman can create a turning point in her life. This is a powerful message for all who are searching for confidence, independence, and lasting happiness in the modern world. The preceding story and its characters are a work of fiction I have composed. They are not based on a true story. The narrator for the story above is Voice A. The positive takeaways that can help audiences live happier and more joyful lives after hearing this story include knowing how to respect your own value, daring to protect your legitimate rights, not remaining silent in the face of injustice, maintaining your strength in difficult times, believing in your own capabilities, knowing how to choose the right partner in life. Understanding that honesty is always the foundation of any lasting relationship. Learning to let go when necessary to start over stronger. And always remembering that true happiness comes from living authentically as yourself.